Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart. The High Elf realms for Warhammer the Old World are finally nearly here, up for pre-order in a few days' time. So I thought it would be fun to do another High Elf related painting tutorial.
Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Counter-Attack Bases. They stock a wide range of counters, gaming aids and movement trays for multiple game systems and offer custom items to suit your club, your event or even your podcast or YouTube channel. Check out the link in the video description. The Eagle Claw bolt thrower is one of the returning plastics, and funnily enough it's one I haven't owned before. I had High Elves in 4th edition, had that box set, and the first miniature I added to the plastics from that starter was the metal version back then, and I absolutely loved it and I kept it for years. I had Island of Blood High Elves as well, but didn't have a bolt thrower, and I managed to pick one of these up recently on eBay. Not in the best condition, but I've cleaned it up enough to do this tutorial today. Well, here it is, all cleaned up, filed up, a bit of old glue removed and primed black, ready for painting. So here we have two thin coats, Gravestone Blue and Model Air White. Model Air White is just a really easy to use white through the airbrush. The Gravestone Blue thins very, very nicely and goes through the airbrush well also. And what I'm doing here, and if you've seen my recent Seagull tutorial, recognise this, I'm doing a lot of the work on the white now, so I want a really nice white smooth finish. So I'm giving it a blue-grey undertone over the top of the black. I'm leaving a little bit of the black in the recesses, but I'm slowly building it up and then adding the white afterwards, being a bit stronger in the white on the bottom areas of those flowing cloaks and things, allowing there being a bit of a transition through from the grey all the way through to the top of the white, and still leaving a little bit, a tiny bit of the touch of that black showing in those recesses as well. So you've got a lot of shadow built in, so it's like a deeper, higher end version of a Zenithal really. You're going beyond Zenithal into the painting the white itself. You see here on the bolt thrower, I'm focusing the white into the centre of those areas, so you've got a bit of a blend towards the edges, and we're going to reinforce that in a moment. But this is doing the heavy lifting on the white rather than trying to build it up layer by layer with the hairy brush. If you're not an airbrush user, you could use a grey and then a white through the rattle can, or just a white and follow the rest of the tutorial. This is Contrast Pilar Glacier. It's a very, very low pigment paint, almost a ready mixed glaze in a pot. It doesn't cover much other than pure white, but it's great for jobs like this. And what I'm doing here is going in where that bluey grey colour, away from that brightest white is. I'm just kind of reinforcing it, allowing it to run into the recesses a little bit there, and then blending it out with my brush. It's so thin you can almost just feather it out with a clean wet brush on its own. You don't really need to thin it, and you can see me being really naughty here, just using it straight from the pot just to prove that point. I have in the past put it on my wet palette, but you don't want to put too much on because it very quickly absorbs that moisture and changes the properties of it. So I'm using it out of the pot here and just putting it around those edges, reinforcing that grey area, blending out. And once it dries, you want to go back and maybe do a second layer just to really push into that sort of darker blue right on those recesses, and slowly you just build up this really nice colour. What I'm doing here is that heavy lifting, is getting myself a really vibrant, striking looking white, which you want with High Elves, but not putting myself through the pain of layering and worrying about how smooth the layers of white are. And this is great. I find this is a really easy way of doing it. It makes the whole idea of painting a whole army of High Elves with this nice bright white a lot less daunting. Exactly the same for the inventory as well. Working on those areas where it's slightly darker grey, and I know it's quite hard to see sometimes on the screen. The lighting effect really blows out the white, makes it look a lot brighter than it is, and flattens out some of that detail. But I'm focusing here around the top of that sort of waistband area, and it is a darker grey there, so I'm just going over the top and then into those recesses as well, and just taking my time with the tip of my brush, building it up. It's actually quite quick, and it's definitely a lot quicker than building up from a grey to a white, as I've already mentioned. What you should end up with is a pretty serviceable white look for army painting. Now, it's optional whether you come back and do any further white highlighting afterwards, and I'll cover that right at the end of the video because I do add a little bit. but you also really don't have to. And maybe if I was painting a whole unit right now, I'd feel less like doing it. Now for some Skeleton Horde and Apothecary White, and I'm focusing here on the whites still, or the off-whites, things that I want to shade slightly now and come back to later on. So I'm using the Apothecary White on all the feathers on all of the bolts, including the one that the crew member is holding as well. And then the Skeleton Horde I'm using on the bit of parchment, which is, I don't know, either the instructions of how to fire the bolt or the target or something like that. But I wanted that to look a different kind of colour white. So giving it the off-white parchment kind of look seemed perfect. For the blue recipe, we have Contrast Alsarum Blue, and then we have Amarth Blue and Hiriath Blue from the Fantasy Games range from Scale Colour. The Alsarum Blue is the base layer, and there's not an awful lot of blue on these miniatures. In these cases, it's mostly the sash. There is one thin strip that goes underneath the mail armour, which I add in at the end so I don't get metallic paint all over it, but we are basically here painting in the sash. And once that base contrast layer is dry, I'm using the natural highlight that using a contrast paint over a light colour like a white here gives you. So you're colouring in here, you're following the lines. You can see very clearly which areas are higher because the contrast is running to all those recesses. So I'm just going in with that mid-tone first as a thin line on each of those raised areas. And then after that, I go back in with that top highlight and add a even thinner highlight in certain areas. And it's as simple as that. This is one of the recipes I use for a lighter tan kind of leather. So we've got the contrast still first, the Garagak Sewer, which gives you a nice mid-tone brown with warmish tones in it, a yellowish sort of undertone. And then afterwards is Gizmo Fur, Manticore Ochre and Cerberus Brown. And you can use as much or as little of those as you want to in terms of highlights. Just the Garagak Sewer and the Gizmo Fur work quite nicely together. But essentially we're covering in all of the waistbands. So in the studio paint job, one of the guys has a leather waistband, the other one has metallic. I've decided to make them both leather. I like the idea they need to be mobile, then moving around, bending, picking up ammunition, but that kind of thing. So the strong armour's not quite so important. Also using it on the boots as well. And they also have sort of wrist greaves. I don't know if greaves is the right word, but wrist armour. Again, I want them to be light and leather rather than a metallic look. I will have the scale mail on there will all be metallic, but the rest, again, I want it to be quite movable. And I'm doing very simple highlighting on top. After that, Garagak Sewer has dried, and again, because it's over a very light base, it's giving you an idea of where to place your highlights anyway. And then we start with that triad from Two Thin Coats, building up layer by layer, each line getting a little bit smaller. Add as much or as little detail as you want when you're painting like this. Maybe using 4 paints for this little bit of leather here on army painting is probably too much, and you could make do with just the Gizmo Fur, that first layer. But again, I got a little bit carried away and kept doing it, and considering I cover the base sometimes with a little bit of weathering powder and things, I probably don't need to on the boots. But the ideas there are how you can group colours if you should wish to. So this is quite a simple skin recipe for army painting, starting with the Gilliman flesh, and we got Shyish purple, Vulpus pink, and then Elven skin as well from the Two Thin Coats range. We're starting with the Gilliman flesh, and I'm just applying that over that Zenithal style miniature already. So as long as you make sure that it only pulls in the recesses and not on the flat areas, you get a nice effect anyway, and you may want to leave it like that, especially when you've got very small areas of skin where it's quite concentrated. The highlights stand out quite well. So making sure that first coat is quite smooth. You're obviously getting the hands as well on these miniatures, and after that I go with the darker purple colour, and I'm using that as a shade mostly around where the hand meets the cuff, into the eye sockets around the edge of the helmet or the hairline or something like that. So you're adding a little bit of shade, but you're trying to keep it fairly thin. You don't want to darken the skin areas too much anyway. Then comes the Vulpus pink, and I like to put this around the mouth, sometimes the nose and on the cheek, so you're warming the bottom part of the face. I do the same thing often on the tops of the hands and in between the fingers. So just a little bit, and I do thin this usually a little bit on my wet palette. I'm actually being lazy here and doing it straight out of the pot most of the time, but I'm dabbing it on the miniature, quickly adding a bit of water and blending out. So showing you all of the bad habits. Sometimes that water is just from my mouth as well, without returning the brush to the pot, because I have lots of bad habits and things, so don't do that at home. But essentially what you're doing is tinting the Guilliman flesh base layer that you've already got there, adding a little bit of darker tones in the recesses, and add a little bit of warmth back with the reddish tones as well. I follow up after that usually by doing my eyes, so if I mess them up I can fix them up, and then right at the end I go back in with that highlights of the elven flesh in this instance, back over the bridge of the nose, over the cheekbones, forehead, that kind of thing, knuckles, fingers, just lightly picking them out. And this is on my wet palette and thinned slightly just to make sure that I don't mess it up, and that's usually enough. Sometimes you go back with the glaze again, but it's pretty simple but quite striking for army painting. This is Iron George Yellow, Yellow Flame and Trooper White for the hair. Now, Contrast does a lot of yellows and they're all really good, so I'm playing around with them a little bit at the moment. And in the pot this looks a little bit duller and a little bit more desaturated, but as soon as you stick it over a white base like this, again it looks pretty vibrant, so it doesn't quite give you the dirty blonde look that it does at the pot. And appreciate you can mix in things like Skeleton Horde or just use Skeleton Horde if you wanted to, but I'm having fun playing around. And yes, I painted another blonde elf and it's a little bit stereotypical, but it does go really well with the white, and it really goes well with the blues and things as well. And while this probably wasn't the colour I wanted to straight up, it's absolutely fine as well. There's nothing wrong with the colour, and I will find a different colour on a different miniature in the future. But then what I do is just add a little bit of that Trooper White into it, and rather than using that yellow that I chose as the mid-tone, which again was just too bright and vibrant, so just adding a little bit of the Trooper White into that Iron Jaws yellow provided me with a perfect highlight. So it wasn't exactly what I planned, but the end result is fine as well, and it's still fairly bright, but it's got a slightly more dirty blonde sort of finish to it than a vibrant yellow would. Two thin coats, metallics here, Surcoat, Silver, Plate, Armour and Mithril Blade. I'm still playing around with these metallics and seeing whether I really like them or not. And I do like the colour range. They're definitely not as smooth as the scale colour ones, the scale 75 metal and alchemy range, but I do like these. They're all fairly close together in terms of spectrum, so the transition is going to be quite subtle, and we're over white as well, so it's quite bright. That also kind of works for high elves. You want it to look clean. I didn't want it to look too dull and dirty, and I am going to add a wash later on, a subtle one, so starting quite bright is quite helpful. So I'm just working my way up through those three metallics, really a solid base layer on all of them from the Surcoat Silver, and then we just build up after that, focusing where the light is catching most. For the bolt thrower, it's going to have lots of gold on it, but I wanted to make some of the more mechanical parts a metal colour. Not everything's going to be made out of gold or gold plated, so I added a little bit underneath here. You see the sort of mechanical sections where it pivots, where one of the locking bolts is, that kind of thing. I thought, well, I'm going to make this in the same metallic colours as the armour for the crew. But you can see now as I build up the layers through those, as each paint gets a little bit lighter, I'm just focusing on the tops of the blades, on the individual scales. There's not many of them, but I do try to pick them out just by little dots. You get a little bit more transition than you think you would do just by looking at those three pots next to each other. So I do like them. I like the colour choices. I'm not regretting that this will be colour choices for a small army, a small force of them. It works really nicely, as you can see on the helmets here, just focusing towards the top as we build up between the layers. You do get that look of extra shine at the top of the peak of the helmet there. I'm quite happy the way it's coming out, especially as I mentioned before for Elven army, that you expect the Elven armor just to look that little bit cleaner and a little bit nicer. For the golds, I am returning to my favourite metallic brand, the Metal and Alchemy range from Scale Colour, and it's Necro Gold and Elven Gold, and just still haven't found anything that quite matches these as yet. I do need to try more of those two thin coats golds, so I don't own enough to give it a full review right now. So basically starting with the Necro Gold as the base. There's only a little bit of gold on these miniatures anyway. The one shoulder pad on the crew, the edges of the scroll here, I've decided to make those gold, so there's a little bit of difference. And then most of that gold is on the bolt through itself, so all of this sort of posh trim that you have on there. So I'm just being careful now not to get in on any of that white. Cleaning away any paints off white is a bit of a pain. Cleaning metallics is even worse, and I don't want to have to go back in and just kind of play around with all of those whites again. I saved time by doing it with the airbrush, so it is worth now just taking a little bit more care so you don't end up taking more time in the long run. And with that base layer down, it's just a matter of going back with that elven gold and just adding a bit of a highlight, making sure you're leaving some of that necro gold showing as well. So you're focusing around the edges, that kind of thing, focusing on the center areas where it's a flatter plate on the edge of the eagle's nose, on the tops of the gold areas, leaving it in the recesses, all of the normal stuff, all the standard layer painting that you're likely to do. Using Spirit Stone technical paint. Do they still make this? I'm not sure. I've had this for ages, but I'm using this on all of the gems for this army rather than painting in the gems in inverted commas properly. This is, again, an army painting tutorial. I want to make something that looks striking, and the white does a lot of the heavy lifting there, but I'm not going in and doing 3 different colors and a little dot highlight on the top, all the standard dual effect stuff that's covered by millions of tutorials. It's great, but I didn't want to do it on these miniatures. And I'm using a grease pre-mixed oil wash also from Scale Colour, Scale 75 range. I'm trying to keep it in the recesses here, but I can tidy it up afterwards, it being an oil paint. I'm using an old brush as well to make sure I don't knacker any of my nicer ones. And if you don't use oil paints, you could always use a sepia style wash here. Just make sure you keep it in those recesses and wash it away from any of those flat surfaces as quick as you can, otherwise you're going to have to go back in with those golds and repaint them. I won't have to do that because this is oils and I'm able to clean it away afterwards. For the mail armour, I made an attempt at just trying to get it to run in between all of the details and not the flat surfaces, but like I said, again, I can go back and tidy this up quite easily with a little bit of artist white spirit in a moment, which really helps me out. And that's what this stage is here. I'm using the artist thinner white spirit from AK. There's loads of different versions around. Just use artist stuff and not your DIY stuff. Little bit, same old brush again, but make sure you got a little bit of paper towel there, clean, tap it off, and you can just wipe away any of that oil that gets stuck on the flat surfaces, and it just saves an awful lot of time. It's particularly useful on the backs of the helmet, so I add a little bit of oil in there into that little indent, that little recess. It was a little bit too big, a little bit too much. I was just able to take it back off to add that shine back, but still leave most of it there in that recess and just tone it down a little bit. Now White Star and Dark Sand for the remainder of the miniatures, and this is very much optional stuff. This little parchment here, I want to brighten it slightly because I want to paint something on it. So I'm using a little bit of the dark sand first, thinned on my wet palette here. I'm sort of sketching this in almost just with the tip of my brush, not going in too heavy. It means I'm not building up layers, focusing on those edges and then working in a little bit rather than kind of looking at those deeper shadows. So sketching it in really lightly, and then I go in with a little bit of white as well onto the edges of it just to make it really sort of pop and stand out. But the white is mostly used in this stage here, and I mentioned this right at the top of the video near the end of the section on the white and my processes and my reasons for doing it to create a really simple smooth white. And you may choose not to do this if you are following along, and I nearly didn't just for the sake of this video. It's one of those things that I can't stop myself from doing sometimes, and I wanted to add a thin white edge highlight to just some of the areas, just some of the top folds. The danger is if you go too thick and you get too much of a standout highlight, then you need to blend it in by doing more and more and thinning out. Before you know it, you're painting lots and lots and lots of white. So I'm trying to be really careful here just to do the odd little line and not start working and blending on the flats of that cloak, staying with what's there. You can see me turning the miniature on its side and just catching the edge of it, and I think I've just about got that right without getting too far into normal brush highlighting. But you can leave it without, but it does add a little bit of vibrancy and a little bit of pop to it. So if you are following along at home, I'll leave that up to you. Maybe save that just for your characters and things, but I didn't mind doing it here. I did it a little bit on the sea guard as well. There weren't such large flat areas, which is always the danger because you start working on a large flat area and then you add a little bit too much white. You've got to start blending all the way through. Here, I didn't need to. When it comes to the bolt thrower, like you can see now, just running my brush along the edge of those sharper edges, which there aren't many of, and I left it and stuck with just those sharp edges again. Just makes it stand out, pop a little bit more, adds a little bit more definition. I copied one of the little runes from the uniforms and heraldry for the High Elves book. I think this one means Farsight or something like that, which seems to fit for someone shooting a bolt thrower. But after that, it was very much just edging in those bases to really finish it off, and they were done. Let's have a look at some proper pictures. I hadn't originally planned to make this video at all. It wasn't part of my schedule, and maybe looking at my schedule now, it probably should have stayed out of it. But it arrived in the post from eBay. I've never painted it before, and I thought it would be something that's fun to do. And I also thought it'd be nice to have a video to put out just after the High Elf pre-order was announced. Yeah, we'll see whether it was worth it in the long run, and whether it puts me behind on some of the other more important things. But it is something to do with a little High Elf force that I'm going to be working on for something in the future, and I did have fun doing it. I'm more so conscious that there are many techniques here that were also covered in that recent Seagull tutorial, and maybe covered in other future tutorials, and I know that can be a bit samey for people, but it's a break also from a lot of the Empire stuff I've been doing recently. So hopefully you've enjoyed it and found it valuable. I've definitely had fun and learning a lot about how to do a nice clean white quickly, which was the most important thing, and I feel confident I can do it for a small force now. And luckily with High Elves, they're fairly elite, so you don't have too many troops to paint for an army.
Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed that, found it useful. There will definitely be more High Elf tutorials and content on their way very, very soon. Let me know in the comments below what you intend on pre-ordering at the weekend, if you're watching this around the time of the pre-order going live. Obviously, if you're watching this a few months down the line, I'd be really interested to hear if you're building High Elf armies, what you've gone with, what theme, what Army of Infamy, maybe you're sticking with Grand Army. Love the conversation around any Warhammer the Old World army, so do pop those in the comments below. If you have enjoyed the video, please do give it a like as well. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. There's absolutely loads of Warhammer the Old World content on the channel, a lot of it hobby related like this, but much discussion stuff and things like that as well, so it's well worth subscribing so you don't miss out. It's also loads and loads of content from other game systems on the channel. There's hundreds and hundreds of videos on there, so please do check them out. Please also check out the channel sponsor, Counter-Attack Bases. There's loads of custom dice, obviously, on their website, and they're very, very reasonable prices, and they ship pretty quick as well. But they also have loads of pre-made stuff, counters and things that help you in-game game age for much of the major game systems out there. Many of those you can get customized as well, so do go and check those out. Check out my other affiliate links. So dry brushes from Knott's Hobbies and little sponging tools are absolutely brilliant, and I've got a affiliate link for Warlord Games as well. But most importantly, if you really would like to help me out, please do check out my Patreon. It really is the best way to support me in helping to continue to make videos like this. It's time consuming, I love doing it, but the more patrons I have, the more content I can make. It's as simple as that. But thank you very much for watching, take care, and I'll catch you soon.